All right. Good afternoon, all of you non-World Cup soccer fans joining us this afternoon. My name is Phil Napoli. I am the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy in the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And I just want to thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. Topic, of course, is disinformation, social media platforms, and threats to democracy. We'll probably dovetail into some related topics as well. Obviously, always a lot going on in this space, and we've got a couple of speakers today who are well versed in all of this. So I'll move right into introducing our panelists today, and our plan is to I'm going to sort of hit them with questions for the first half of the hour or so. And then turn it over to you all to ask questions using the chat functionality, and that will be the second half of the session, giving everyone a chance to ask some questions. So thank you all again, especially as the holidays approach, for taking the time to participate in this. Our panelists today, first, I'm so pleased to have with us Nora Benavides. Nora is the Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. And our second panelist is Harold Feld, Senior Vice President at Public Knowledge. These are folks who work in this space in a variety of ways and have lots to share with us today. So let me begin. We're going to really, try to let some of the current events issues guide our conversation to start. And so let me begin with this question. As we all know, right, policymakers in the U.S. Have been discussing and gathering information and holding hearings about various issues related to hate speech and disinformation on social media for quite a while. But we haven't seen much action. What we have seen lately, though, is some interesting things going on, for example, with Twitter. So I'm going to start, how can we not, right? Start by asking you to talk a bit about Twitter and what you see in terms of what has happened in the wake of Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter that adds anything new to the policy conversation around social media. Are there important lessons for policymakers to take from, Twitter's ongoing meltdown? Thoughts on that?
I'm happy to get us started. It's great to be here with all of you. Phil, you are an expert and a luminary in your own right. So while you're moderating, I feel like it's such an honor that you are moving us through this conversation, Harold and I. So thank you. I love starting with current events. The Elon Musk, the Twitter issues could consume hours of conversation, and we don't really have that. So what have we seen recently? I think it's useful to just do a little tiny bit of table setting. Elon Musk took over Twitter about a week before the midterm elections here in the US, after many months of will he, won't he, should he, shouldn't he? And he is, on the one hand, I think a perfect villain for some. He's also a staunch advocate himself, self-proclaimed free speech advocate. And where is the reality? What we've seen since Musk took over Twitter is a number of things. One, we've seen use of the N-word rise 500% in the first 12 hours he took Twitter over. Use of the N-word rose 1,300% just 2 days after he took over. The number of tweets containing slurs has risen since he took over. I won't go through all of those stats, but there is just a content problem that we have seen. He gutted staff from the CEO, the COO, the head of trust and safety, moderation teams, ethical AI teams, the contractors that are tasked with reviewing content. So his hope had been he could gut what was there to build something better. Unfortunately, we haven't really seen the build something better piece. And I think for policymakers, one of the most important findings is that the steps companies take actually make a difference in their ability to mitigate and blunt the spread of problematic, violative content. There has been a sort of long arc in trying to convince people both on the Hill, researchers, advocates, allies, and other sectors that the relationship between our online world and then the experiences that people have in the real world is something that actually is worth discussing. That's taken a long time to build up. And I will say that for those here today, the number one issue we keep coming back to is the steps that leaders take on social media have very real consequences. They have consequences for people experiencing hate, harassment, as well as a number of other issues that then extend into things like elections, voting, democracy. So it's worth thinking about, it's worth monitoring these issues long-term, because those are the moments for intervention from policymakers and regulatory agencies.
Thanks. Harold?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Nora's saying, because everything she said is true, there are a couple of, if you will excuse me, meta themes that I think we can draw from here. One is, if you characterize everything as a dumpster fire and it's awful and it's miserable, just sort of generically, you lose track of what an actual dumpster fire really looks like. The other theme, though, that I want to take is there are good points about these social media platforms, and on Twitter, we are now seeing them violently destroyed. The fact that we have a mass exodus of real sources of information and you know, reporters, experts, other people who have actually made Twitter a very worthwhile for many of us platform, are exiting in droves because of what is going on here. And also, one other lesson that I think is very important is the personal power that is invested in the unchecked personal power that is invested in the individuals who run these companies. The fact that you know, Musk can simply censor, turn off all the people who dare to criticize him, that he can endanger people's lives because he's decided that he wants to throw former employees under the bus and divert attention from his own failings. You know, these are things that really matter in the real world, and where you know, we ought to be very concerned. And I'll add one other, which is, there's a common trope of, well, if you don't like what the social media platforms are doing, just go and start your own. And what we're seeing here is, again, communities that people have invested years in building are now being destroyed with no obvious place to go and no way to prevent or remedy this on their own. So whatever rights an individual may have and whatever solutions we think ought to be the case, we need to recognize that there are enormous costs to people and communities, social costs, not just in losing their existing connections, but in all of the things that people have invested to build social capital through these platforms over the years, is now being just torched by one irresponsible individual.
Great, thank you. Nora, you mentioned something I wanted to get into next too, like on the current events front, and that was the elections. The midterm elections are, you know, in the fairly recent past, and my sense was that the predominant narrative was this sort of post-election, this sort of collective sigh of relief that, oh gosh, you know, what we imagined might happen didn't happen, and the takeaways there are that indeed maybe our democracy is a bit more stable than we thought, or at the very least, both the platforms and platform users are becoming more resilient against the barrages of disinformation, for example, that might be circulating there. That's my sense of kind of what the predominant narrative is, and part of my question will go, you know, underlying it is, you know, is that an accurate narrative? But in particular, I wanted to get your take on, as people who monitor these platforms and what's happening so closely, what are some of the key developments you saw in relation to the midterms in terms of, new developments, new strategies being employed by bad actors, new actions or new strategic approaches that the platforms are taking. How has the platform ecosystem evolved since the last election, right? It's very important that we don't, that our thinking about this space evolve, because this space evolves so rapidly. So what to you are the key developments, the key new wrinkles that the midterms reveal to us?
Well, I mean, first, I love the question. I love that you bring us to a moment to counter, are we hopeful? Are we not? Which is some of what I was asked a lot in the days that followed the midterms. I personally felt that there was at least some evidence that voters have been resilient to disinformation narratives, just as you say. The funny thing then is that when I did interviews, I would speak with reporters, the conclusion was always that I personally am a very hopeful person now, that disinformation may be over. And so I would love to temper that potential perspective with a few anecdotes. Yes, absolutely. Voters seem to display some resilience in a few obvious ways. There were dozens of election denier candidates around the country that were running on campaigns and rhetoric about the big lie that the election had been stolen, and a number of other more local elections related to Donald Trump's arc. Most of those candidates lost, and many voters have been quite public. There were only 4 of those candidates that won their elections. That's a pretty strong victory in favor of truth, in favor of a reality that is real and grounded in evidence and data. So that's one piece that I just think we need to understand as the groundwork. What are new tactics? I think that honestly, a lot of non-English and Spanish language, Russian language, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese language disinformation is targeting many people on social media, particularly things like WhatsApp, where conversation is encrypted. Large groups of us could get together. And if we are all in a single chat in another language or even in English, it often comes within a sense of trust and community, that Harold is someone that referred me to the WhatsApp group and we're in the same community and I'll trust what he might say, in a way where you might not see and believe what the New York Times or Fox News posts on your Facebook feed. It brings a different level of trust in those types of encrypted platforms. We've also seen a mix of disinformation and hate. And that's something that feels, the word disinformation has grown tired, and we need to move beyond it because the forces now are maligned and malign. They are a mix of hate and toxicity and conspiracy with moments and kernels of disinformation, falsity. And that great examples of that are the targeting of election workers. There is a thread here where there is both disinformation and targeted violence, calls for violence in those types of posts. So that's something new, and we haven't seen that in the same way. There's a lot I could talk about, and we don't have a whole lot of time today to talk about what platforms can be doing, what they were doing. Generally, I think that our ecosystem has evolved to the point where we cannot trust now that the conversations each of us see on our social media feed represent a dominant sensibility for the country. The platforms themselves are not agnostic. They are not politically or socially or financially agnostic. And their preferencing, their amplification, the back-end machine learning tools that they use to amplify content, whether it is advertising or other recommendations, do play into the reality that we see for each of our feeds. And that ultimately means that, Phil, your feed might look different than mine, but you'll believe that the things you see are the dominant or predominant and growing narrative. And election results show us that that was not really the case. So I look forward to talking, later today about some of the metrics for what companies should be doing, other mechanisms for implementation.
Sure.
Yeah. So just again, totally agreeing with everything.
Harold, you have to go first next time. So
you get to go first
hopefully
next time.
we find a way to disagree about something.
I'll do my best, but just to add a couple of things to this. Number one, we have seen improvement by social media platforms over the last 4 years, 6 years, in the sense that the most obvious, easily pluggable holes have been plugged. It's not 2017 anymore. We understand, kind of the rudiments of bot armies and, the sort of, Facebook's giving you a bonus point for, controversial ads, which warp the way these things are recommended. The recommendation algorithms have gotten more sophisticated. It's not just, the most violent, the most extreme get promoted. There are a variety of reasons for that. That said, the biggest thing I think for this year is TikTok, which has now become a substantial platform for exchange of information, for promoting candidates, and which has the least developed policies for addressing deliberate disinformation. I do think that a tactic that we are seeing is what we might call flood the zone, which is, okay, I can't get you to believe false things, but can I get you to distrust true things by having so much out there that you don't know where to find accurate information? I think what Nora has said about people in the circle of trust has always been true to some degree. What has really changed a lot is that people have gotten more sophisticated in their basic family circle of trust. That is to say, by this time, you know which one of your relatives are going to be sending you all kinds of, what their political orientation matches as being information that they want to believe is true, regardless of whether it is actually true or not. So we compensate for these things. There is a history in electronic media. Tim Wu has, wrote about this in his books, The Switch and the Master Switch and the Attention Merchants, of, people learn more. They do grow more resilient to the same old tricks. I think that the other really big piece on this has been the emergence of alternate platforms where the hate and it's kind of the worst the organizing around harassment takes place freely. Where on Facebook, there and the other major platforms, there was at least some effort to try to police these things and to crack down on incentive to violence. I think one of the things actually that is worth studying that hasn't been studied is whether over-inclusive algorithms have an impact on time-sensitive speech. I know just my own personal experience, there were a lot of people I know who got thrown into Twitter jail, or Meta jail, and when they were trying to have discussions about the election that were time sensitive. So, there are some impacts we may, again, hard to know precisely at this point the subtler ways in which these things impact and affect the discussions. But again, I think that when we talk about how harassment is being organized, it's less common, unless you're Elon Musk, to see on the major platforms a really popular person put something out that is targeted to a specific individual. You still see it, but people are a little more clever than that, where you really see kind of the organization for local harassment of individuals is on 8chan and Truth and Gab and these other platforms that their policy is to have no content moderation policy, and therefore it is much easier for people to organize in a very obvious way harassment campaigns that affect people in the real world.
Right. Thank you. And since you mentioned it, it was not part of my original question lineup, but the news is the news. So if I could stick with you, Harold, you mentioned TikTok, the legislation that was just introduced to essentially ban TikTok in the US. And of course, we've seen a number of states already ban TikTok on government-owned devices. Wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and whether that, is that an appropriate response to the dangers that TikTok pose, or is there some alternative approach that you would think?
Well, it's important to recognize that those are motivated much less by the idea that because TikTok has an audience that skews young, because TikTok does not have developed policies in place that it is implementing, that therefore there is a lot of concern about vectors for misinformation or harassment. The concerns that are motivating these steps are more the Chinese government has the potential to directly influence or obtain information from TikTok. TikTok, like other social media platforms, is a vacuum of your personal information and gets into your devices and sucks up all of these. So the concerns that have been motivating this legislation have not been oriented around the issues that we were discussing, but have been much more oriented around this notion that TikTok represents a threat to national security as a consequence of their information gathering and their connection with the Chinese government. I cannot help but think, now y'all know how we felt in the public interest community when NSA was revealed that they were actually doing all this spying, and how other countries around the world reacted to American telecommunications providers and these services, when the fear was, well, NSA is getting a backdoor into everything that AT&T touches or Google touches, or so I'm like, this is something of a global problem. I don't think we can just dismiss these concerns, especially because we can at least try in countries that are democracies to put limits on our spying by our government, and we can't reasonably expect limits on spying by totalitarian regimes. I do think, though, that a total ban like this is not an effective answer, and it's very difficult to implement. So we're going to have to see how this evolves.
Nora, okay, if you need to add to that.
Well, we are closing down the year, and certainly where Congress has room to move policy, for any staffers, for members who are here, for others. I think the ultimate question where this TikTok legislation relates is the flip side, to me, we have to consider, and that is the privacy and data rights of users. As much as it is a national security concern, or potentially worth discussing, how platforms that are based in other countries, what they are doing if they are multinational companies, those questions all bring to me questions around our basic data privacy rights. And so if we are interested in those questions, I think then we should be interested in moving policy forward that creates a floor, not a ceiling, for data privacy. And I know we're going to get into some of those ideas. So I would just say that it feels like if we're asking in the one breath about TikTok, where it should go, who has the right and the access to that, we actually have to flip the question and say, what are the basic protections users should have? User empowerment and the experience, the agency they have should be our ultimate goal.
Right. Thank you. I want to switch gears now actually to the state level, where we have seen some interesting developments of late. For example, governments of Texas and Florida have both passed legislation that to varying degrees sort of characterizes social media platforms more like common carriers. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's happened in both of those states, particularly from the standpoint of First Amendment implications. And whether there is anything useful in the sort of common carrier regulatory framework that could be brought to bear in the social media context.
All right. I'll in keeping with
Come on,
the.
common carrier. This is all you, right, Harold?
Oh yeah. Well, I'll let Nora disagree with me on some of the things that I'm going to say. But first of all, I do think that both of these laws have fatal flaws, in no small part because they are clearly driven by this unproven and I would say mistaken at best, deliberately false at worst narrative that these companies are woke corporations that are trying to suppress the speech of real Americans. And, there's never been any evidence of this. And as we're seeing now where, Musk has taken over Twitter, it's not a question of, up or down checking people based on ideology. It's just a question of enforcing your anti-hate speech policies. The common carrier, I would say, is not a particularly good tool for social media. Not for a lot of the reasons that people argue. That is to say, common carriage is not simply dependent on old technologies. It has been applied to new technologies as they continue to emerge, not because common carriage is dependent on monopoly power. It is not, but because common carriage really depends on the idea that there is a service here that doesn't need to make individualized judgments. You get, a taxi cab and a shipping company are common carriers, in part because whatever is inside the boxes, it doesn't really matter. I treat the boxes the same. It doesn't matter where they're shipping from or who's shipping them. It's easy for me to treat them the same and makes sense for me to treat them the same. Social media and to some degree search, by definition, require more individualized judgments, both because relevance to the individual and what the individual is looking for is dependent on the individual. For the telephone, it's people either call me or I call them. I don't ask the telephone, hey, make a recommendation to me about pizza places near me. And whereas that is something that I ask a search engine or ask a platform like Yelp or talk about with people on Facebook, and the relevance of those things is a function of, I'll call them individual judgments, even though we all know this is being done at scale by artificial intelligence algorithms and so forth. So common carriage doesn't really seem to have much to say to social media because it's not really a good fit. This doesn't mean that there aren't other places that we might look. Public forum doctrine, which is different from common carriage, is potentially an area that might be of value here. Or simple procedural rules that don't get into detail, but have to do with kind of how you run your business, because your business is an important business, may well be applicable in these cases. But we don't need to go with common carriage, and common carriage isn't a particularly good fit here. And it's hard to escape the feeling that a lot of the conservative folks who are talking about common carriage are doing so because it's childish, kind of a childish response to the net neutrality fight. Oh, well, you like net neutrality over there, so we're going to have neutrality over here. It's like, yeah, no, not the same. Really very much not the same. So.
Well, I hate to say it. I don't think that what I'm going to say then is largely divergent, though I come at this from a different perspective because my background is, in free speech and the First Amendment. And so these laws, I actually just from the outset here, agree, Harold. I think part of what you're saying is that the common carriage framing is a red herring, and or at least that's how I feel. So it sounded like you were moving in that direction as well.
Yeah.
And so given my own background in expression and speech, I read these bills, and they are now the ones that have become law and have been challenged in Texas and Florida are not the only ones. So just contextually, we have to understand this is part of a larger movement to target and narrow speech. What is defined as acceptable speech, whether that is in classrooms, in the street, in newspapers, or here on social media. And so there's actually a very odd bedfellows mix when I come to this group and the concerns and challenges around these laws. What's happened is that states are now allowed to impose penalties on social media companies for actions they take as private companies to remove or moderate content. From the outset, I just like to really dumb it down. That is, government is imposing some kind of penalty on private speech, dictating, and whenever that state government seeks to do so, picking and choosing when the removal of speech is problematic. To me, that is everything we have always wanted to avoid in US context, as well as in other countries that value free expression and speech. The obvious conclusion is that states picking and choosing speech will pick and choose whatever speech is acceptable in that era. So I'm not just talking about this year or next year. I'm thinking of 7, 12, 20 years down the line. And that is very troubling precedent. So I think that these laws ultimately need to be viewed through that prism of First Amendment jurisprudence, and that the role of our legislatures, whether it is state or federal, are to maintain a balance. They should not be at the state level seeking to penalize private companies. If anything, we should be enhancing transparency on these companies through their mechanisms, encouraging auditing of algorithmic decision-making, increasing data privacy for users. There are a host of other principles and policy recommendations we can make. It is not through the lens of states regulating private speech.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I come from a very different perspective and sort of get to the same conclusion, but somewhat more, but not 100%, which is to say, I start from a telecommunications and media background where communications policy has been concerned with bottleneck control of the means of electronic speech. So starting with broadcasting and the scarcity doctrine, moving on to cable, now moving on to broadband, where if you look at availability of content on the internet, it's vast and diverse, as the Supreme Court has said, as diverse as human thought itself. On the other hand, if you look at who can actually provide you with access to that, you're lucky if you have more than 2 companies in your neighborhood. The Communications Act and the kind of thing about this is used to thinking about how do we enhance the ability of individuals to speak and receive diverse content, overcoming potential bottlenecks in between, but without having the government choose the speech, which is a complicated problem. Common carriage works in a particular set of circumstances where here we have this sort of funny hybrid where on the one hand, in broadcast land, we're used to the idea of, well, we've got individual licensees that make these decisions. And they have to, because otherwise it would be the government making these decisions. But at the same time, we recognize the enormous potential for damage that these licensees can do by, holding up individuals and harassing them, which is something that used to happen in the early days of radio. Hate speech, which was a big problem in the early days of radio. The ability to tilt political contests one way or another. So we're used to this. Well, we'll have structural things like ownership limitations and other things that try to ensure that there are multiple perspectives in that speech market, going down to sort of traditional common carriage where it's like an individual talking to an individual, where we say, hey, that's easy. We just make sure that the pipe in the middle is a dumb pipe and can't get between the two. Social media, like cable to some degree, creates a challenge to either one of these perspectives. And the complicated thing that we have now from a policy perspective is, so we don't want to go just let's treat these as newspapers, because that would be like only 3 or 4 newspapers for the entire country. We don't want to treat these precisely like, broadcasters, because they're not. We don't want to treat them like internet access providers, because that's totally the wrong model. Where do we land here? And that's where these other First Amendment doctrines, things around public forum doctrine, which look to sort of traditional places where individuals can express themselves, but where we impose reasonable time and place regulation, and where in a private setting, the private the Pruneyard case being the archetypal example, where we say, okay, you're allowed to have certain sorts of limits that would interfere with the ordinary use of the shopping mall in that case, but not restrict based on content or totally ban people, and other sorts of ways of looking at this, some of which have yet to be tested. So it's kind of a very complicated and yet to be settled area, even if we both agree, that the core First Amendment questions that you're framing are exactly the right ones. And they're ones where the history of electronic media regulation has some lessons to teach us, but cannot be definitive.
Right. I'm going to move now to questions from our audience. First question. Do you feel like multinational tech and social media companies like Meta impact state power or authority or legitimacy? Big question there.
Yeah. Nora, you want to go first, or?
No, go ahead.
All right. So the short answer is yes, and they can do so in a good ways and bad ways. I mean, the fact is that without social media, we would not have had Ferguson. We would not have had the revelation to a majority, and I will say a white majority of this country, of what goes on with policing in this country on a daily basis. What we're seeing now in Iran, even where they have shut down internet access and social media, continues to leak out of that country because of the availability of these large social media platforms. At the same time, there is also the ability to enable violence, genocide, for governments to manipulate content. So these platforms are very powerful tools. They are tools that can have enormous influence on the public perception of government, both within a nation and internationally. There's a reason why a lot of world leaders announce stuff on Twitter, although I think that's becoming less common and other platforms are becoming more common. But there was a reason why we had Twitter diplomacy, because it had a potential to shape state action, state power in a way that had previously not been available.
I mean, I know we're coming up on time. We have a lot of questions that are coming in. I would just say yes and no. I think in some ways, anything that is open for discourse and engagement is also open for weaponization. And that can happen both by state government and state powers, as well as by others. So, I look at what's happened in Brazil and the power of social media to, on the one hand, oxygenate a fringe set of beliefs, as well as then things like Maria Ressa challenging what happens in the Philippines, that there are ways it cuts in both directions. So that is my very, very short response.
Thank you. Next question from the audience. Which social media tech monopoly bills before Congress do you view as most likely to have legs in 2023?
Ooh, most likely to have legs or most likely to be discussed? Those are going to be
I'm not sure what have legs
things.
quite means, but
well, I still haven't given up hope for 2022, even though that hope is but we got an omnibus coming, so who
yeah. I will start, and I actually am, I'll answer this by describing some of what I also hope has legs. And a lot of the work that I do now is trying to motivate and mobilize groups that typically do not engage with members of Congress, particularly grassroots and communities of color in non-English languages, civil rights communities. I encourage and work with those groups to learn new muscles to work with all of you. I think first and foremost, the ADPPA is one of the most powerful and comprehensive bills that we have. It also provides authority and strength to the FTC, which we don't have much time to discuss today, but that is an important agency for all of these issues. Their new rulemaking, which has taken up the question of commercial surveillance and lax data practices, is a meaningful one when it comes to disinformation in social media. So I hope and am anticipating that the American Data Privacy and Protection Act is one that has legs, but it's big, it's clunkier than others. And so there is that caveat with the understanding that bigger bills mean more vying and a number of industry concerns. But we are seeing a rise in state legislation and privacy laws that would just make it easier for a single federal bill to cleanly provide that floor for data privacy. I think when it comes to other monopoly bills, that's a really interesting question, because there is a body now of these competition leaning types of proposals, anything from the JCPA to ICOA. I don't know about you, Harold, I go back and forth between the full names, the acronyms, saying the letters, saying the phrase. But some of what I think this year did was provide runway for these to be conversation starters where they had not been previously in the same way. And that in and of itself, in opening up debate, and in light of how far the EU has moved and outpaced the US, I anticipate that next year we will see, I hope we will see Congress trying to take up these questions with more fervor. The issue on our free press side, I will say, is that many of these bills have what I believe are unintended consequences, which in the spirit of competition seek to solve something that may in fact create different outcomes. I don't believe that competition alone can mitigate disinformation, for example. And so bills that in the spirit of moving forward and limiting monopoly, I think in many ways just give open playing field for hate and disinformation to stay on platforms. And we've done quite a bit of research on that front. I'll put in the chat or in the Q&A. We just released an op-ed today in Tech Policy Press about the JCPA. So I will circulate that while Harold is talking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say it's interesting because I don't generally think of ADPA as a competition bill, and it's also not just a big tech bill. It's an effort at a comprehensive privacy bill, but and I think part of the problem is people think of it as primarily a tech bill, which is both good and bad. I will point out that while supportive of ADPA, there is a real big problem with ADPA in that it eliminates the FCC's privacy jurisdiction, where FCC protection of phone privacy has been part of the Communications Act for 90 years, and it's something that has been very successful. And I would hope that a 2023 version would not include what essentially amounts as a giveaway to big telecom as part of the tech lash. I will say that I think the Something that we have pushed and that I hope there is further discussion on, although I don't think it will pass, is the push for a digital regulator generally. That was a bill, the Digital Platform Regulation Act, the Digital Platform Commission Act, excuse me, which was introduced by Senator Bennett and soon to be Senator Welch, which says this is a sector of the economy that is vital and important in many ways, as we've been discussing, and it needs a sector-specific regulator. The FTC is simply not enough. Even if you dumped a whole lot of money in it, it still would not be enough to deal with the problems that emerge from this sector. I don't expect a bill like that to pass in 2023, but I certainly hope, especially in light of what is going on in Europe, where there is now an EU-wide legislation in the Digital Services Act, which has established an EU-wide regulator in the form of the European Commission in a very interesting and novel way, where I think that we are going to, see a lot of lessons and hopefully have a lot to talk about in this regard. I will add that, we completely agree with Free Press that the JCPA is a terrible idea. So of course, like most terrible ideas, it is probably the one most likely to be revived in 2023, which is unfortunate. The one that I am actually hoping, and where I think, while being completely supportive of ACO and hoping that gets in there, my bet for what has the most legs is probably the Open App Markets Act, or OAMA, where I think there is much more consensus about bipartisan consensus, not just that there is a problem, but that this is the correct solution to that problem. Whereas I think on ACO, we've seen some significant, unfortunately, not nearly as much consensus on the approach in ACO as we would have liked to have seen, since it's a strong bill. So, if I had to pick one bill that I think is going to come back in 2023, I would hope it's the Open Apps Market Act, but I'm afraid it's going to be the JCPA.
Great. Next question from the audience. Are there limitations on what government can do to combat misinformation and hate speech online in light of Alvarez, Brandenburg, et cetera? You can almost flip that question and say, what if anything can be done in light of Alvarez, Brandenburg, et cetera? But yes, so speaking about sort of, what space is left for government to combat misinformation and hate speech?
I'll start. The crux that people grapple with is that misinformation is speech. It's what people are saying. What rights do we have to then hold those views and express them, versus what rights do companies have to take actions, and what limits or parameters within should government be working to mitigate what we now know are very obvious real world harms that misinformation and disinformation, including hate speech as well, can cause. A lot of my work centers on this question now, and there is, even if it sounds corny, no easy answer. That's why the last 5, 6, 7 years of our debate has been trying to grapple with what are the boundaries here. And one of those is that the often intuitive sense is, well, maybe we need to criminalize these things. That is not accurate. And what we've seen around the world is that instances, attempts by governments to criminalize disinformation, purveyors of disinformation, ultimately lead to the quashing and the targeting of dissidents. That has been seen in Singapore, Morocco, Brazil, even Puerto Rico had a piece of a constitutional amendment at the beginning of COVID to limit purveyors of disinformation, and it just targeted journalists trying to report on credible issues that people were worried about regarding the pandemic. So there is a piece of this that just early onset, like we have to think about what are the various levers we can pull? And criminalizing misinformation and hate speech is really one of the wrong paths to take. There are steps that companies themselves can and should be taking. I have just released a report called Empty Promises, which looks at how social media companies are on paper protecting users, and then how they are doing that with their enforcement of those policies. Ultimately, we have found that even the most basic user protections are not being adequately implemented by social media companies, leaving room for hate speech to thrive. And with consequences targeting election workers, the LGBTQ community, Black voters, Native American voters, and others. And there's been a lot of good documentation on that front. And then when it comes to what Congress can be doing, I think that there are key principles. The foundational one is transparency, because we still only get snippets or slices of what companies are doing and the outsized attention that misinformation receives society-wide. We need better measures for understanding that. And from there, there can be a host of other types of actions that can be taken to rein this in. But criminalizing is not the obvious first step. It is often the worst consequence, at least from a legislative perspective. And I will share in the chat a few of the other measures that we have put together. One of them is through what's called the Disinfo Defense League. It is a network of over 250 organizations trying to blunt racialized disinformation, which affects voters and leads to disenfranchisement, among many others. We've put together a policy platform of 9 key principles for Congress, which include establishing people's rights to own our data, limiting tech collection and use of personal information, enhancing data transparency, preventing discrimination by algorithms. These are the steps that are building blocks for hopefully safer and more open types of exchanges online.
Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of time, I will just refer everyone to my book from 2019 called The Case for the Digital Platform Act, which I'll put the link to the free copy in the link, although you can also buy it from Amazon if you want to support PK. And I always point out that's not hypocrisy. It proves my point that you can't avoid these guys. I mean, it's like Ticketmaster, basically. But the other thing I'll point out is Chapter 5 is entirely a discussion about this, about the First Amendment frameworks, what the First Amendment questions that are raised, what you need to do to create a record. And I'll also throw in Chapter 6, because Chapter 6 is about the somewhat harder question, which is, how do we promote the positive things that media policy has traditionally tried to promote? What Cass Sunstein has referred to as the Madisonian view of the First Amendment, which is difficult but not impossible. There are a bunch of things I think we can do to break the filter bubbles, to expose people, at least give people information that there are other choices out there. And one of the big ones I like is that I've recommended is every random number of recommendations, the recommendation engine flips a major field with regard to you. So that, by which I mean, every 5 recommendations on YouTube, it assumes you're a woman rather than a man. And see what is differently recommended to you based on that change in input. That is, a way in which we can break out of the sort of filter bubbles and the kind of cycle through which these recommendations feed us more of the same, and actually at least expose us to the possibility that there are related different perspectives.
Right. Thank you. We're getting close to time, so I wanted to sort of toss some wrap-up questions your way. I'm going to use a holiday theme here. I think to some degree you may have already touched on this first one, so feel free to skip it and go to the second one if you want. But the first is, if you could put one thing on your holiday wish list from Congress, what would it be? And 2, if the platforms could have, if you could say to them, here's what your New Year's resolution should be, what would you recommend to the platforms that their New Year's resolution be? Take either of those.
Tough one. I'll say, what I'd like here, of course, would be the Bennett and Welch digital regulator passed. Maybe a little more realistic would be the passage of ACO and the Open Applications Markets Act. The resolution, I would think, for the platforms for next year is actually invest in the stuff that you know what you're supposed to do. Every study shows that there is chronic underinvestment in content moderation teams, in non-English language, in the risk management. These problems are hard. We get that they're hard. I don't blame you for failing occasionally. I do, however, blame you for trying to do it on the cheap. And that is something, and I'll add one other thing that particularly important is mental health support for the human beings who have to sort through this stuff. It is really horrible, the psychological impact when it's your job to go through the worst garbage that other human beings can produce and make judgments about it. And that is a job that really, really needs psychological support, and the companies ought to be providing it.
And of course, we're in an environment now, right, or a moment in time where these companies are not quite, printing money the way they once were, right? And so if they weren't throwing the necessary resources at this when they were that flush, right?
Every company, this comes up in telecom all the time as well. Every company is lousy at judging how much they need to pay for things that don't directly contribute to the bottom line. So every internet company knows that they don't want to have outages, but it's a lot easier to estimate what you need to build a reliable network, because you are just naturally going to make the most favorable assumptions and figure out the least amount that you think you can reasonably get away with, even when you're trying to do it right. So, figure out what you think is the least amount you can pay, and then double it, and you might become.
Nora?
Well, I'll try to answer both in one similar way. And that's really because my background is in civil and human rights. I think about real people, users, their experiences. I would invite, challenge, and urge that both social media companies and Congress think about real people, and that they center their actions with knowledge and empirical data about those experiences. What that means for social media companies, Harold, I 130% agree with everything you said, actually. One, mental health is major, but we have a long history now of records of social media companies not only failing to take seriously the role they play, but failing to ever come to the table in meaningful ways with civil society or with Congress. I have worked with so many wonderful members who have tried to advance some kind of accountability and can't even get responses that are written in respectful tones from social media companies. Their general unwillingness, I would say almost reckless disregard for the role they play is so obvious now. And so not only are they underinvesting, they're barely paying lip service to what they actually do. They roll out election policies, for example, a month and a half before elections globally. None of this is good enough. And so the problem is dire. It is just as dire now as it was 2 years ago, and it will be all the same next year and the year after. And so they have to be more adequately investing people and auditing the machine learning that is behind what they think they can automate. So that's one. For Congress, real people matter. And we don't have time to get into some of the ways that social media has created experiences and left people out of opportunities and access. But I believe that that comes back fundamentally to the data about us and the way it is collected, analyzed, retained, sold, and even forgotten about, all often without our consent. And ultimately, I would say that's my number one goal and hope for a holiday wish list is center privacy and data protections.
Great. Well, thank you. We will end the conversation on that note. I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you so much, Harold, for taking the time. Thank you to everybody who has attended this today, and thanks to Lizzie Devitt and Jeff Harris from Duke in DC, who put all of this together. I hope everyone who attended found this to be as enlightening as I found it to be. Again, thank you both for your time and your insights today, and happy holidays to everybody. And
Thank you, Phil.
And France won. So it's a France-Argentina final.
Oh my God. I looked one time during the thing and that was it.
I totally don't follow soccer, but I will confess I was rooting for the Moroccan underdogs there. So
I don't either. And I was with you, Harold. Oh my God.